Welcome, everyone. We're really excited to have everyone here today for our Chicago Wilderness's conversation on reimagining healthy communities for people and nature with Dr. Carolyn Finney. My name is Dr. Kristen Voorhees. I work at the Chicago office of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and I'm excited to participate in this conversation today with Dr. Finney. The way our day is going to go is we're going to have a 45-minute-ish talk by Dr. Finney, and then we'll have a discussion that follows. Some of you submitted some questions from the pre-poll survey for that, and we'll highlight those. But if you didn't, please use the Q&A and not the chat box to drop questions during Dr. Finney's presentation so that we can combine those and have those ready for discussion at the end. So without further ado, I want to also thank our silver sponsors. Oops, somebody said they can't hear me. Is that true? Okay, people can hear. Sorry, thank you. I want to thank the silver sponsors, the Nature Conservancy and the United States Department of Agriculture's Forest Service for their donations. We'll get started now with my introducing Dr. Finney. I want to start off by saying Dr. Carolyn Finney is a woman who loves people and is resilient enough to expect and hope for us as people to grow in these emergent spaces that she creates with our conversations. I got the chance to meet Dr. Finney when we were first organizing this event as a part of the Chicago Wilderness Congress in 2020. And I asked her about her work because I'm interested in doing similar types of work in my career. And she directly asked me, "Do you like white people?" And I appreciated the directness and candidness of that question, because when doing this kind of work, you really do have to like and care for the people who are different from you so that we can agree to all work together to grow in this way. So I could go through Dr. Finney's whole academic resume, but it would really be more of a sort of recipe and not the fruit of who she is, the fruit of her passions. And so to highlight some of those fruit, Dr. Finney was an actress for 11 years before she backpacked across Europe for 5 years, showing her love for performance and for people. She got her PhD in geography, and then, as many of you are familiar with, produced the book Black Faces, White Spaces while she was at Berkeley. Right now, she's an artist in residence at Middlebury College in New Hampshire, where she continues to do this work of helping to create emergent spaces for conversations around difference and equity and inclusion. And she also teaches and is producing a one-woman show. One of the other comments I just had to make about Dr. Finney was she introduced me to Anna DeVere Smith, a MacArthur Genius Grant winner, who is her motivator. And similarly, she is passionate about connecting performance and communication and information. So without further ado, I introduce Dr. Carolyn Finney. Oh, you're still on mute, Dr. Finney.
You know, sometimes people like it that way when I'm still on mute, but thank you. What I was saying was, thank you for such a great introduction. I did want to make one small correction and let everybody know that I'm actually based in Burlington, Vermont. Middlebury College is in Middlebury, Vermont, but I've been living in Burlington for about the last year and a half. And you all are welcome here in my lovely, humble apartment. Second floor of a 2-story house in downtown Burlington. I've got 2 young women farmers who live downstairs who always leave me lovely bags of produce, which is kind of awesome. I want to thank Laura and Lydia because we've been on this thing. This was all supposed to have been in person last spring. I'm sure a lot of, like a lot of you had to change your plans. And so I'm really happy to be here and that so many of you have decided to engage with me today in this conversation. I also want to thank the sponsors. Sometimes I forget about that, the people behind the scenes that I don't see, but also their support makes it possible for me to engage with you all today. So I'm going to talk, one of my favorite things to do for the next 45 minutes. And I want to thank Kristen, which I'm going to say again. And also I want to remind everybody, I promised that yes, if you start to have questions while I'm talking, please put them in the chat. Christian and all, we'll be playing around with as many questions as we can when I'm finished talking. And something that I want you all to keep in mind, and I'm going to just assume you may already be thinking this, but I want to say this just in case you're not, is that part of asking questions is also the practice of how we do this work. You know, I'm much less interested whether or not you agree with me. I'm not saying these things today in hopes that you agree with me. If you do, fantastic. But actually, I'm interested in how we come together across our differences. And so I'm going to say to you that I'm going to trust in your good intention, and all questions are valid. And let's have that conversation a little bit later. Okay, so I got some slides to put up, some things to say, some stories to tell, some truths to reveal. Well, some of it may not be revelation. So I'm always playing around with my title based on who it is that I'm speaking with. So I call this one Black Faces, White Spaces, Christian Cooper, John Muir, and Playing the Long Game. So yeah, I always, you know, I was telling Christian, we met about a year and a half or so ago when I was giving a talk around my book, Black Faces, White Spaces. And I say, you know, a lot of the stories I pull, some of them I tell again and again. Sometimes I change them around. Sometimes I have brand new stories. What is really important for me is always taking what it is I know and have learned and grounding it in the present. And what I believe is true for everybody, you know, there's these larger contextual issues that are happening that are affecting us all in different ways, right? We know the COVID-19 pandemic. I mean, I don't know about you, but a year ago, I was on a plane almost every week visiting people, having these conversations in person. I'm someone who lives alone. So, and you can already tell that I'm a serious people person. So that has been a real trip to kind of get used to that adjustment of switching online. George Floyd, the murder of George Floyd, actually Christian Cooper walking into Central Park and having his skin weaponized, and George Floyd being murdered has really changed, I think, all of our lives in different ways, but I can speak for me very personally, has really been an interesting and strange moment for me to have more opportunity to do the work that I care about. And also, it's about my own body, right? The body that I live in, the Black body that I live in every day. So it's really personal. And at the same time, you know, we had an election year, and I'm not trying to be political, except it is political. And, you know, I put that map in the background because it highlights these divisions that many of us are saying, wow, you know, didn't realize how divided we actually are. And what I'm always saying is, oh, we were always divided. Well, we've been divided for 450 years. There is no way, right, that you can steal land from the original people and in many cases kill them, enslave another group of people to build the land for free, hire another group of people to build the railroad, but then disregard them from history, intern other people, and it goes on down the line without thinking that we have always been divided. It isn't the only thing that we are, but for me, it's a truth that's always been there. What's interesting about these three things coming together in the moment is the potential and the possibility. I am an eternal optimist, which doesn't mean, I'm not saying that I never get angry, sad, discouraged, all those other things like a lot of other human beings. I'm just saying that there is something about this moment and this opportunity that once again, we have a chance here in this country actually to address some things we've never done before. Or let me rephrase that some of us have never done before. Yeah, so stories of now. So a couple of things. And I may seem like I'm going off somewhere, but just stick with me. It'll be a fun ride. So I love Lovecraft Country. If you haven't seen it on HBO, please immediately put that in your to-do list. I love science fiction. This series was based on the books of H.P. Lovecraft, who wrote a lot of science fiction and what he called weird fiction. And so I'll watch anything. And like the rest of you, or like many of us during the pandemic, I've been binge watching a series of things, but this is one of the really good ones. So Lovecraft Country, the story takes place in the 1950s, right after the Korean War. It kind of focuses on Chicago, but there's also quite a number of scenes and moments in Massachusetts. What I want to say about this that's really different from a lot of other science fiction. This one has crazy looking monsters with big teeth and a lot of blood. It's got witches and magic. I mean, there's time travel. There's all kinds of things happening. There's astronomy. I mean, there's just a lot going down here without me giving anything away. What makes this one different for me and why it was so powerful, for myself, is because it's centered on an extended African-American family. So Black folks were at the center of this story. It starts off in Chicago, where this You see some of the folks here in the car, where some members of this family decide they're going to go on this road trip from Chicago to Massachusetts. And they're going to do that because there's supposedly this white family that does magic and they're connected and they want to find out. So it's going to be a big adventure, right? It's an adventure. It is Indiana Jones meets Lara Croft's Tomb Raider. All this is happening. So you're seeing the usual excitement and nervousness and anxiety and preparation that they're making as human beings to go on this journey. The thing that makes it different is because they're Black people, and it is the 1950s, which is Jim Crow segregation. So as they're all piling into the car in Chicago, getting ready to go, the matriarch of the family is going to stay behind. And she has her notebook in front of her, and everybody's excited and laughing. And she's just casually going through the list to make sure they have everything they need in the car, that they have blanket, they have extra food. She goes, let's just make sure we have everything. And what she's doing is referencing the Green Book, because the Green Book at that time was something that many Black people used. If they were going to travel anywhere in this country by car, they needed to know, especially during Jim Crow segregation, what restaurants they could eat at, what hotels they might be able to stay at, what bathrooms they might be able to use, all the things that all of us would be concerned about if we were taking a road trip. It's just the fact that they made it so natural, right? It wasn't like, oh my God, this is a race series. It was about Black people. So you can't not talk about race in the United States if you're Black in the 1950s during Jim Crow segregation. But they didn't make it the center of the story, just part of the story. A little bit later on their road trip, they are almost at their destination, but they get pulled over by a white state trooper who lets them know that they had about 7 minutes before to get out of the county they were in, because the county they were in was a sundown county. And a sundown county, sundown towns, some say still exist in different parts of this country, means that if you were Black or if you were non-white, you better not be caught in that town after sundown, because anything could happen to you then and be supposedly legal, I say that in quotes, to do that if they wanted to kill you, lynch you, whatever it is they wanted to do. And it shows them in that final 7 minutes trying to make it to the county line. I bring all this up to talk about, they eventually run into monsters in the woods and there's a fight that ensues and all that happens, but it's the day-to-day ducking and weaving, I call it, that, interspersed with their lives, with their adventure, with their joy, with their courage, with their fear, with all the things, the myriad of human emotions that we experience. But the difference is, because they were Black and because that perspective was centered, it actually added dimension to the story, right? Doesn't mean that everybody couldn't relate to them at multiple points. But I think for me as a Black person watching it, I went, oh my God, it's like if I did it, if this happened to me. I always joke with people and say that, I love time travel stories, but in my body, there is nowhere I can think of that I want to go back to in time in my body. Because the reality of that is not like most of the time travel movies I see, where it's more of issues around technology or something like that. It's like, I'm a Black woman. Like, what period of time am I going to go back to where I'm not probably going to be in serious trouble, right? And face serious trouble. So I really love the way the movie grasped that. So hold that idea for a second, the idea of whose stories get centered and how that changes the way we explore something. Not what do we leave out and erase, but what do we have to expand in order to include? I read an article just yesterday or 2 days ago. I read this article and it was from only about 2 weeks ago, and it was in a Paris Review, and it was called "Isn't Black Representation What We Wanted?" And it was written by an African-American journalist, Muir, and I'm looking down at my notes because I want to make sure I get a quote right. And she makes 2 points. So she brought up the author Fran Lebowitz, who argues that a book is supposed to be a door, not a mirror. And Fran asked the question, why does everyone want to see themselves in books? And Maura Cheeks, the African-American writer, in response says, quote, she says, I understand this sentiment, but I disagree with the argument. It's the type of sentiment that can only be felt by someone who was unknowingly represented almost everywhere she turned. She didn't know what she had, end quote. Later in the article, Fran Lebowitz is in a discussion with Black writer Toni Morrison. And again, it comes up again. And Fran asked the questions, why does everyone want to see themselves in books? She said, again, she says, a book is supposed to be a mirror, not a door. She says, and Toni Morrison said, well, I am the reader. I am the reader of the books I write. And Leibowitz says, your other readers aren't you. And Morrison replied, oh, yes, they are. Right. So it's also this idea about who is framing the story, right? For me, it doesn't make Fran Lebowitz as a white woman wrong, but it's really interesting about the set of assumptions she has about, yes, a book is supposed to be a door, not necessarily a mirror. And Toni Morrison saying, oh no, it is also a mirror. If you've been somebody who hasn't shown up in a story, there's a reason why, we center Blackness or center our own experiences as Black people in a very particular way, not simply because we want to talk about ourselves, but it's not only about us. It's about all the Black people, brown people, who are usually not seen, but are also there. How do we make the case for a broader sense of representation? And that includes in nature, in the environment, in the great outdoors, which I think is why most of us are here today. So like I always do, I got to center myself a little bit in the story. And I want to preface this by saying the primary reason I do this is not simply to talk about myself, which I seem to like to do, but I do that in part for the case I just made, which is I have to bring myself in the room. But I also do that to invite you to consider your own perspective, because we're all biased here. Everybody is biased. Bias is not a bad thing, right? Or it's not a good thing. Bias is a point of view. It's about your subjectivity of your perspective. What does it mean when your perspective of the world is privileged in general out there? Whose perspective is not privileged here? I also like to tell my own story because I want to tell you that I'm biased. I am, this is personal for me. This is political for me, and it's intimate for me. It's hard for me to imagine that it's not those things for everyone else. I'm talking about, my relationship to non-human nature, my relationship out in the world, my relationship to other people, my ability to be seen, my ability to engage, my ability to have mobility, to move, to have freedom, to have agency, to be seen as someone powerful and creative, to be invited in, to be in relationship with. Yeah, these things are personal for me. So I want to tell you a little bit about, where I grew up, where I started, because I always got to bring mom and dad, no matter how old you get, right? You always got your parents in one form or another. So these are my parents, Rose and Henry. Rose and Henry, this picture was taken in the 1950s when my dad had just come back from the Korean War. They grew up in Floyd, Virginia, which is near the Blue Ridge Mountains. They grew up in very poor families, very large families. When my dad came back from the Korean War, he tried to get a job. He told me that one of the jobs he tried to get was actually with the Park Service. He said he saw a park ranger in a park ranger uniform. He thought that looked like a great government job. He went to apply. And what they told him was, I'm sorry, but we don't hire Negroes. So my father, and my mother, like a lot of other Black people at that time in the South, moved north to New York. My father had a sister in New York, thought he might have better job opportunities. When he got there, he had two job offers. The first was in Syracuse, New York, which is about 5 hours north of New York City, where he could be a janitor. But the job he ended up taking was only 30 minutes outside of New York City in Westchester County. And that's the pictures you're seeing here. A very wealthy Jewish family owned a 12-acre estate. And what they needed was full-time caretakers for this estate, people who would live on this estate, care for it day in and day out. That's the job my parents took. So my father was the gardener, he was the chauffeur. My mom was a sometime housekeeper for this estate. Swimming pool, a small pond with fish, vegetable gardens, fruit trees, absolutely stunning 12 acres. I'll show you a couple more pictures in a second. A very wealthy, all-white neighborhood, and very wealthy with Harry Winston at the time with property down the street, Wingfield Golf Club around the corner, Schaefer Beer next door, just to give you a sense of the wealth. So we were the only family in that neighborhood well into the 1990s. A Japanese American woman moved in for a few years and then she moved out. So late 1950s, my parents wanted to have kids. They thought they couldn't have kids, in part because my mother, like a lot of women, both Black and white who were poor, had gone into the hospital to have a cyst removed from one of her ovaries. And without telling her or asking her permission, they removed one of her ovaries and later told her the reason we didn't ask you is because we didn't think you could emotionally handle the information. So for a while there, my parents thought they couldn't have kids. And because of that, they adopted me. And then what I like to say, through the miracle of nature, they relaxed and had my first brother, and then some more relaxing ensued, and then they had my second brother. So the original owners were usually only on this property on weekends and holidays, which meant that me and my brothers had run of this place like it was our own private park. These pictures have not been doctored, and actually these pictures are from like the 1990s, just to give you a sense of what this property looked like. We were playing outside. We all knew how to swim by the time we were 7 because there was water on this property. There were woods to play in. You know, we were eating the peaches and apples off the trees. I mean, it was really an incredible and stunning place to live. But the other story that I always tell to people is the story when I was 9 years old, walking home from school, my first run-in with the police. So 9, 4th grade, I went to a public school. You know, I was right around the corner from the house when a white policeman in the car stopped me, and he wanted to know where I was going. And I gave him the address, and I said, 1000 Old White Plains Road. And he just looked at me and said, "Oh, do you work there?" And I remember thinking that's kind of odd because I'm 9. But what I said was, "No, I live there." And he just kind of looked at me. He said, "Okay." And he let me go. I went home, told my parents. My parents called the police station. They gave him hell about it. And they never stopped me or my brothers again. But as an adult, right, I have to think about the logics behind that question. I was a little girl, 9, school bag, time of day. Maybe you could be stopping me to make sure I'm getting home. There was a million things that could have happened in that interaction. But why he assumed that the only reason I would be in that neighborhood, the only reason I'd be walking there is because I work there. I'm not sure what he thought I was doing at 9 years old, but that question remains for me. This is I called it the big house when the owners would come up on weekends and holidays. Here's another photo right in front of that swimming pool was the lake that also I rode my first boat on and fished my first fish in. Really lovely place. I want to jump ahead into the 1990s. By the 1990s, my parents had been caring for this land for nearly 40 years. The patriarch of the family had died. The matriarch was very sick. And so the question came up, what's going to happen with my parents, right? They've been on this land for nearly 40 years. She thought about keeping them on this land. This property was worth over $3 million at the time. Property taxes were over $125,000 a year. You know, my family did not come from money. So we had no sense of the ways you might loopholes or way that could work. We were actually beholden to whatever the owners thought they wanted to do. At the end of the day, she had a house built for them in Leesburg, Virginia, because at this point, me and my brothers were both grown. I was traveling too much, moving around. So was one of my other brothers. But my youngest brother got married, had kids, and settled in Leesburg. So that's where they had a lovely house built for them, actually, on a ½ acre of land. The matriarch passed away, the new owner came on, and my parents stayed on until 2003 because there always has to be somebody on this property full time. Eventually, the new owner found a family from the Dominican Republic, you know, to move in a place. My parents moved out. And that's when this came home to me in a very particular way. I hadn't been living here for a long time, but this is whenever I visited my parents, which was fairly often, this is where I would come. So this is always going to be home for me. And I'm always going to think of it in that way. When they moved to Leesburg, I watched both of them, but particularly my father, get very depressed. He talked about missing the land. He talked about having no land to pass down to me or my brothers. And no matter what we said, like, you've given us everything, you know, no matter what we said, he was really hung up on that idea. And now that he has early stage Alzheimer's, it's actually on a very particular loop of him thinking about the land and missing home, and that this is home, even though he grew up in the state of Virginia. They received a copy of a letter from one of their old neighbors, and the letter was from the Westchester Land Trust. And the land trust was letting them know that a conservation easement had now been placed on this piece of property. My parents gave me that copy of that letter, which had pictures of this estate. And it talks about all the environmental values of the estate, right? I'm going to go back one, right? It talked about the wildlife on the property, where it sits in the watershed, all the reasons why it needed to be protected in perpetuity. And at the end of the letter, it thanked the new owner for his conservation mindedness. The new owner had been on the land for about 3 years. There was nothing acknowledging or thanking my parents who'd been on the land for nearly 50 years. And just that fast, they were erased. that's when it got even more personal, because really, honestly, I'm writing and talking to you about my parents, but I'm also writing and telling you about myself, just the sense of how fast and how easy it is to be erased out of a story about a place that my parents labored on, a place that they came to love, a place that me and my brothers came to love, a place that we identify with, all the things that so many of us who work in this field broadly defined think about and talk about, the spiritual connections, the personal connections, the physical connections, all the way we show up here, gone. And I'm not saying the Westchester Land Trust are bad people. I've actually started talking with them as of late, and they seem like very nice people. But privilege has the privilege of not seeing itself. It's really interesting what gets centered in a story. Who gets centered in a story? What has value? What doesn't? What isn't seen? What is not? In part because my parents and family being on this land is complicated in terms of issues of ownership, whose ownership counts. I mean, it gets into a really complicated conversation, in part because it actually reflects and resonates a little bit with our history in this country collectively. I put this up here now because now there's gates on our driveway. There never used to be, but there are. And I put up the question, when we say public lands, what public are we talking about? I am fortunate enough to have spent time as an advisor on the National Parks Advisory Board for 8 years. There's so much I've learned and come to respect and love about what we call public lands. But in truth, the whole truth there is I'm actually really uncomfortable with the term public lands. Because again, I want to say, what public? Who gets to get? And what about the private lands? That means we don't get to talk about those. You only get to talk about those if you have enough money and call them, you're the owner of it. Does that mean you know it? Do you love it as much? What about all the people who labor on it, who work on it, who make it possible for the rest of us to enjoy it? Like, where are they in this story? What does that mean? And what does that mean as we move forward with all the ways we're talking about a myriad of environmental issues, how we're going to engage going together? So there's something about this moment, as is with most moments, but this is a real special moment of convergence, I think, with everything, right? With the, Black Lives Matter, the talk of systemic racism, the pandemic. And the pandemic also tells us something beyond how it's changing our day-to-day lives. The question of us getting more and more, what's a nice way to put it? Intersected with non-human nature, places and wildlife, and what dangers and challenges that poses, not just for the wildlife, but also for us. What does that mean in this moment? And for me, our history is always with us. Wherever we go, there we are. And I think there's a segment of our history we have never fully reconciled because it is really hard to look at. Those two original sins, those two, right? We took all the land we stole, let me be really clear, all the land from indigenous people, and we enslaved another group of people of African descent to work the land for free. So our relationship with non-human nature, in my humble opinion, has always been contentious, hurtful, hard, a difficult one to consider. And it depends on who you ask. So I put up all these images, right? Images of slavery, images of immigrants crossing the border, images of what we're doing in some cases to the landscape around us, images of indigeneity, Japanese internment, along with the famous pictures of Gifford Pinchot, who founded the Forest Service, and very thoughtfully engaged the idea of conservation and how we might manage the resources for our use, as well as the famous picture of John Muir and President Roosevelt standing on overhanging rock in Yosemite in 1903, again, seriously and thoughtfully having conversations about ideas of wilderness, who we are as a country, because never forget, any talk about the environment is also a conversation about who we are as a people. They are one and the same, blended. Wow, national parks represented ourselves to the world because we did not have the historic buildings of Europe or some other countries in the world. But what we had were the Everglades, the Grand Canyon, Yosemite. We had these incredible spaces and places. So yes, for me, they are one and the same. And when we leave out segments of experience on that narrative, we leave out segments of people on that narrative, and we all lose there. I think about how I don't like diminishing anybody up here in this picture, because for me, that's not useful, or canceling them out. But I do have to challenge them. I do have to ask the question, well, that's interesting that you, all three men, were having these conversations. How did you consider, or did you consider, 1862, when the Homestead Act was placed, that gun went off at midnight. For the most part, if you were of European descent, you could go out on that land. You could grab up to 160 acres. If you stayed on that land for 5 years, if you built a structure, if you farmed, you could then have that land. It was yours, free and clear, right? And land is never just about land. It's about economic and political power. It is about legacy. It is about the right to say that you belong. And who lived on that land before that had to be moved in order for that land to be available for those of European descent? And wait a minute, because I do not want to diminish the people of European descent. Something like 60% of them did not survive that effort. Some of them probably didn't want to leave their original homes, but had no choice. They were being brave. They were going on the road. They were doing the thing like the people in Lovecraft they were doing. They were about to build their new lives. So I don't want to diminish them, but I have to ask that question. And when 3 years later, Emancipation Proclamation happens, enslaved Africans are freed, they're given 400,000 acres of land until white plantation owners said, what have we done? Because we've just given people who we had enslaved as our property 400,000 acres of land. And land is never just about land. It is about economic and political power. It is about legacy. It is about the right to say that one belongs. I do not think so. And they took all that land back. You did have some African-American homesteaders, but nowhere near the numbers like you had with people of European descent. So now we get a few years later, 30, 40 years later, to Gifford Pinchot talking about managing the forest for our use. Muir and Roosevelt thinking about wilderness and what does that mean for us as people and how are we going to protect these spaces during Jim Crow segregation? Because if you were Black and non-white, what did that mean? You weren't left out of this simply because we're talking about the environment or non-human nature or the great outdoors. It might not have mattered as much to someone of European descent, but it absolutely mattered. And it had to. You had to have your own version of the Green Book, at least in your head. You had to have your wits about you. If you were trying to make your life, if you loved the outdoors, if you wanted to be in the outdoors, you had to think about it wherever you were in this country. You had to think about it all the time, which doesn't mean you didn't feel great joy and excitement and anxiety and courage and all the things we feel as human beings. But the way you understand that story and tell it is a little bit different. So for me, as I think about this moment and how we might move forward together and do that better, right? I think it's really important that we have to face what is before, not just talk about it, but actually figure out what that legacy is that brought us to this moment. Why are we having this moment of reckoning around race? I believe we're having it is because we never fully addressed it. We never fully addressed what do we mean by white supremacy. Whiteness is not a bad thing. Nobody can help the skin they were born in. Nobody can help that, right? But it is, as James Baldwin said, about power. And to understand, it doesn't mean that there aren't people of European descent who haven't struggled, who haven't given their all, who haven't worked hard. It's not just about that. I get that. But there are some things that Black people and non-Black people have had to consider and contend with their entire lives because their ancestors had to contend with it. You know, I always tell myself I can never be incognito. You know, in every space that I've been in, whether it's an institutional space, an organizational space, out in public, in the great outdoors, I have had it called to my attention for my entire life, which doesn't mean I'm not a joyful, loving, happy, optimistic human being. But I got other elements in me that are distrustful, angry, sad, hurt as well, like a lot of other human beings, in part because I'm never quite sure how I will be perceived. So how do we address that? How do we reconcile that moving forward? This is meant to be a moment of lightness where I say that everybody has a metaphorical afro. This is my metaphorical afro. I need to update her a little bit because there's all kinds of people up in my head at this moment. always thinking about the pandemic. It's hard not to, always thinking about the murder of George Floyd and what it means at this particular moment. But there are also a lot of other people that influenced me, have influenced my thinking around this work initially, and people of all backgrounds, actually. And I just put a handful of them here, like Toni Morrison, Cornel West, Jane Goodall, Carl Sagan, man. I keep saying it every time, but I wish I had the chance to meet Carl Sagan. He really moves me. And as well as movements and ideas and cultural icons and moments in history, as well as those that I wish weren't in my head, because it's in the news and it shows up in my head and it has me thinking about the complications and the complexities of a conversation like this, because none of us is ever only just one thing. And before we are anything, we are human, right? So we come to it that way with our frailties and our fallibility at every moment, including within this conversation. Also, I really did have an afro, and as I've been saying lately, and overplucked eyebrows. Yikes. So, I start off the book by saying Bamboozled, borrowing very specifically from Spike Lee, who was talking about how we've been bamboozled in the media around African-American representation. And for me, again, to reiterate a point, is that we've been bamboozled around the larger environmental narrative in this country. And that is directly related to the national narrative as well. I don't want to deny manifest destiny. That's a thing, and that counts. I don't want to deny the experience of those of European descent who risked their lives to start anew and gave themselves over to the idea of what this country can be. I ain't denying any of that. But what about everything else? What about slavery? What about the idea that in the 1930s and 40s and 50s, if you were Black, there were certain beaches you couldn't go to, certain hikes you couldn't go on, certain parks you weren't allowed in. And even if there weren't signs saying you couldn't, you better think twice about it. Sundown towns, being unwelcome. Actually, we're still there. There's elements of that we know is still true today. There's a reason why when Christian Cooper walked into Central Park as a gay Black man, and had his skin weaponized against him, that wasn't, unfortunately, unusual. Right? It's like, is this still here? Yes. Many of us would tell you it's always been here. And we haven't actively addressed it. There's a reason why, for me, the question of representation is such a powerful one, right? And I often show this image to make the point. The 2010 cover of Vogue magazine, the first time they put an African-American man on the cover, LeBron James with the beautiful Gisele Bündchen. And then, because a lot of Black people on social media got upset because they said, well, that's great. You got the fabulous LeBron on your cover, but why does he look so primitive and primal and animalistic? And somebody uncovered this poster from 1917. I want you to look at that poster next to it, right down to the color of her dress. The editors say they didn't know about this poster. Needless to say, I don't really believe that. But even if I did, there's something in our consciousness there. There's something troubling there. The idea that historically, if you were Black and brown in this country, you were often seen as not fully human. So being connected with animals wasn't a great thing. Going back to nature wasn't a great thing. You were working hard to be seen, let's put it this way, the way that many white people were seen. Right? As being civilized, as being cultured, as being educated, as being central to the American story. But if you were Black and brown, World's Fairs at the end of 1800s, early 1900s were often on display in cages as the things we want to move away from. I always tell the story of Otabanga from the Congo. I believe he was 18 or 19. He was put on display at the American Museum of Natural History in New York. And then because the museum folks didn't think enough people would see him, they moved him to a primate exhibit at the Bronx Zoo, until protest got him out. And there are more and more stories this way. When we jump ahead to our first self-identified African-American president, President Obama, and you start hearing talk show hosts like Glenn Beck saying, Obama's Planet of the Apes, or someone else in West Virginia saying Michelle Obama is an ape in heels, or pictures of Sean Galonis, the cartoonist for the New York Post. When the stimulus bill came out, he did a cartoon of a dead chimpanzee with stimulus bill pinned to his chest, 2 white cops and smoking guns standing over it, over and over and over. If you want to say that I am too sensitive, I'd rather be too sensitive than not sensitive enough. Because the idea that this has been going on for so long, it is deep in the roots of who we are. It is in our DNA. And I will argue that every single time. It's not the only thing in our DNA. but this is also in the DNA of who we are. So yes, some folks are going to be sensitive to the meaning behind this. What are we perpetuating? What stories are we perpetuating by our representations? I'm so excited now. I had to look at my clock to see where I am. I'm almost there. This is something that I talk about. I always talk about Brenda Palms Barber because the idea of outreach. Do I want to skip this? I kind of do. I might come back to that because I want to say these other two things first. And if we have time, somebody can ask me about the question of outreach and I'll tell that story. But the last two things that I want to say here is I want to talk a little bit about John Muir, because one of the many articles that came out last summer was the idea that was the fact that John Muir was also racist. He was a deeply thoughtful man when it came to non-human nature. He produced a lot of interesting and deeply felt ideas about our relationship as people to nature, this nature outside of ourselves in wilderness. I will say I have some respect for his commitment. You know, the dude was seriously committed. Also, in some of his writings, he talked about Black people and Native people in a very particular way. He was racist. I mean, those things are difficult to hold. I don't want to cancel John Muir out. One of the reasons that when all these articles started coming out last summer, I actually got really excited. In part because the great-great-grandson of John Muir, Robert Hanna, reached out to me and said, would you do my podcast with me about this conversation? And I said, yes, I would love to do that with you. And one of the first things when we started talking on our podcast, you know, Robert Hanna said that, you know, he's telling the audience, he's saying, you know, the last couple of days after those articles came out about John Muir being racist, all the major networks, news networks were calling me. My phone was ringing off the hook as though something had happened to a member of my family. And I stopped him and said, that's because something did happen to a member of your family. The thing that I always want to remember is that people that we talk about aren't isolated. There's a lineage, there's connection. There's a reminder for myself that I can point to his racism and challenge what that is and what it was and what it means and how it might be changed. But I'm aware that he is connected to a lineage of people who are showing up differently, who are impacted by his presence in very particular ways. And I'm thinking about how I would want somebody to come to me and engage to me. What does it mean for us to engage across our differences and not deny what those differences are, but actually dig deep into what they are in order to figure out who we might be as we move forward, which is why I won't talk about it right now, but I'm working on a one-woman show about an imagined conversation with John Muir, because that's what I wanted to imagine. I'm calling it the N-word, Nature Revisited. I was thinking about Black writer Alice Randall, who back in the early 2000s, she took the famous book Gone with the Wind. Gone with the Wind, you know, Margaret Mitchell turned into a movie. Woo! Talk about some heavy critiques around race and how it was represented in slavery in that movie. When she thought about it and thought, what if this story was told from the perspective of a Black woman? So she created a character that she called it Scarlett O'Hara's mulatto half-sister. That's how she described her. And the title of the book is The Wind Done Gone. It was a New York Times bestseller. I loved it. I ate it up for breakfast. She wasn't trying to be funny. For me, that's when I really started thinking about, oh my God, what if I took one of John Muir's pieces and wrote it from the perspective of a Black woman? So I took his piece, 100-Mile Walk Through the Gulf in 1867, when he took a year to walk through southern states to look at the impact of war on the landscape. I took quotes from it and read it to the audience. I said, can you imagine? You know, some of his quotes were beautiful observations about nature outside of himself. And some of them were racist about Black people. I just read them in his words. Then I created a character called Sojourner Washington Douglas. I rewrote the book and called it 1,000-Mile Walk Was Rough in 1867. And I took real facts of lynchings happening at that time. And I made up stories about her, that she was too dark to pass, so she had to use the back roads in the woods as she tried to make her way north, that she was ducking and weaving through a hostile landscape. And she kept going. She was always on the move, because 1890, Jim Crow, 1900, Jim Crow, all the way up until 1940 when she died, because Jim Crow segregation was still the man. Just to start to give it a point of view that broadens the story. What happens? Not if it's my story or if it's John Muir's story, but actually if our stories come together. What's the new story that we tell about who we are and where we are going? The two final things that I want to say is, that I always say is, this is simply not about anybody being comfortable. A lot of us are never comfortable, have never been comfortable in these spaces, having these conversations particularly in these spaces. And being comfortable is not the same thing as being safe. I think everybody should be safe, and we should create situations with that in mind, but it is not the same as being comfortable. We have to take risks in order to gain. And what does that look like for everybody on this call? I always talk about Svetlana Alexievich, who a few years ago won the Nobel Prize for her work on Chernobyl. And she's from Belarus, and she was on NPR. And I was so impressed with her because Michelle Martin was saying to her on NPR, saying, you know, you made a lot of your own people mad because you said some really, you know, it's like you aired the dirty laundry about Belarus. And what her response to that was, you know, just, you made a lot of people mad, you made a lot of people uncomfortable. Svetlana Alexievich responded by saying, I love my people, but I'm not interested in them being comfortable. I'm interested in them being better. The final thing I want to say, which was part of my title, which was the long game, is that I was really moved in part, and I'm not trying again to be political, but when I was watching the inauguration, one of the points that really got me was when the senator from Missouri, Roy Blount, presented Joe Biden with the gift of this painting, the Landscape with Rainbow, which is painted by an artist of African and European ancestry in 1859. I started looking up Robert S. Duncanson. I was like, what? So this dude was supposedly quite big in the painting world in the way he painted these bucolic landscapes. But what I found really interesting was the way that he painted one with the rainbow, because do you know what rainbow symbolizes? Promise, possibility, a future. This man was living in a Black body in 1859. Supposedly he had mental illness issues around questions related to prejudice and slavery and the whole 9 yards, what he must have been carrying around every day, but he still had promise. For me, I imagine him thinking the long game beyond his life and what becomes possible, that people like myself become possible. So the very last thing I will say, Christian, is two very, very short stories and points, going back to thinking about ducking and weaving through hostile landscapes. There was a story I read last summer about a 15-year-old girl named Brianna Nelson Hicks. She was living in Wellington, Florida, which is a very, I guess, well-to-do white neighborhood. But she happened to live in the neighborhood. She's Black, with her grandfather. She was with two white friends, I guess close to home in the neighborhood. And there was a video of an older white man yelling at her, telling her that she doesn't belong here. The question I have for everybody, one, is I flash back to being a girl and having something, that similar feeling placed in me that I somehow don't belong. What does it mean for her to carry that scar? What does it mean when we think about the role of everything environmental, public lands, the environmental movement, the mainstream, climate change, all the ways we come at this conversation? What does it mean for our national narrative when we're still telling little Black and brown kids that they don't belong here? And sometimes we're not doing it directly. Sometimes we do it by simply leaving out their story and erasing their presence and erasing their family's presence. What is the work that we can do in environmental spaces to change that? So I'll stop there.
Thank you. If there was audio, you'd hear the room full of applause with the 750 folks participating here. I think that we really appreciate just the stories and the information and the candidness, as I mentioned before. So thank you, Dr. Finney.
You're welcome. Yeah.
And for our conversation, we have a lot of questions, but I'm going to start off by talking about, asking you about more of that collective consciousness you described, the thing that is so embedded that the magazine didn't remember the photo that they were emulating with LeBron James. Like, can we talk a little bit about how you see that in the environmental spaces that you've gone to work with National Park Service, and other groups where it's so embedded that we don't even recognize it?
Yeah, wow, that's a great question. And I want to, preface that. I want to make sure that I say really clearly that I work with a lot of amazing people who work at the Park Service, who work at the Forest Service, who work in a variety of environmental nonprofits. And I'm really clear to remember that these organizations and institutions are made up of individuals, right? And so when I critique or say something that I've noticed, this is part of that collective consciousness. Sometimes it's just it is the absence of. How many times in my life that I've walked into a space, and you know, I can only speak for myself, but I will say I've talked to and traveled around this country many times and know that this sentiment is there for also a lot of non-white folks, of walking to one of these spaces and there'll be pictures of people on the wall, of the other readings that I will have when I went back to school and got 3 degrees, and all the readings that would come through, and how often there would be nothing by anybody who looked like me, you know. I am the reader. Yes, books are the door, but they're also a mirror, you know, they're also a mirror. And I know sometimes what's embedded in a lot of that is the, you know, in worst case scenario is the unwillingness to actually deal with that because people just don't want to deal with it because it's uncomfortable and complex. In best case scenario, its privilege has a privilege of not seeing itself. They're simply not aware. So, because that has not been central to their experience. So in general, that's what I mean. I've seen more often than not, just a lack of those stories. I feel that has changed even within the last 5 years. I can see how it's changing and shifting because there are a lot of people like you, myself, and others who are just actively showing up in these spaces and saying these things, and in very creative ways based on how we show up to work on our day-to-day. I will tell you, this includes academic institutions. So I want to make real clear that I say that too, which is why I had to leave full-time academia and develop a different kind of research, because it's happened with me. I've lost jobs. I mean, it has happened because of the same thing. The idea that you've got really smart, really thoughtful people who want to engage this idea of diversity, and whether or not they know it, they think of it as actually assimilation. And for me, when you're engaging difference, then you must be prepared to change. The difference that you're engaging, it isn't always about the difference and the person embodying it. It oftentimes is about you. It is about you, the organization, and the space you're in, which is why when I work with organizations, I'm saying time to do first and foremost, the very first action needs to be internal assessment, to know your capacity, to be honest with where you're at. What is the language you're using? What are the leadership formations that you have in place that may be keeping you? What about that mission statement that's been around for 50 years that had nothing to do with people that look like me and Christian? We would have never been in the room, you know, which isn't to say there isn't something good in that. One of the things that I meant to say, but this is perfect because I'm going to say it now, is I say to people, it's not about throwing the baby out with the bathwater, but you definitely need a new bathtub. I'm sorry, you need a new bathtub unless you really don't want to change. And then that's on you. You can make that choice. But if what you want is to change, you need a new bathtub. It is not about assimilation. So don't have to stand up and I'm going to be like, what? You know, like,
yes. And it resonated because I mentioned I'm with the Fish and Wildlife Service, and I was in a conversation about, we were talking about partnerships between the federal government and private landowners, specifically private landowners who own forest lands in the southern US.
Yeah.
And the speaker was from one of these groups, also one of the, and non-governmental groups. And they showed a picture of their family on their homestead, black and white photo. We've been in this house for so long. And what I felt in that moment was so triggered as a Black woman, because I don't have that photo or that land history. And so that brings to mind that question that you brought up about land and what land means more than just land, and so the public-private land part.
Yes. And one of the things I want to say to that about the picture is sort of an addendum to a project I'm working on now around the land I grew up on. So the New York Botanical Gardens had sort of reached out to me about doing a kind of residency, working on this stuff. And I told them a story about the estate that I will share with you now, talking about that when my parents were living on it, for their 40th wedding anniversary, my father had bought my mother a weeping cherry tree. And actually, I can show you a picture just because I can. And I like looking at it. But really, I want to show you the picture. So you can see it here in this picture next to the fuchsia hydrangea bush. And when they moved, obviously they couldn't take the tree with them. But what they did, they are on a half an acre of land. They bought another version, another weeping cherry tree that they planted. But one of the stories I told New York Botanical Gardens, when I told them this and the erasure of my family's presence on this land, they were like, you know, we're a major institution. I bet you we could get permission from the land trust and the new owners, get on the estate, take a sampling of that tree, bring it back to the New York Botanical Gardens and somehow tell the story, which for me was really, the offer was moving. I thought, oh my God, that would be incredible, because also not having that, you know, that figurative black and white photo of this long history there. Well, the land trust said they were down too. There was brand new owners on here. There's been another set of owners, so they don't even know me or my parents, right? So what happens? The last owner did, the new ones don't. Back at the end of December, the land trust said, well, let us get on there. I had sent them this photo you're seeing here and say, this is where it is. And I just assumed that everything was protected in perpetuity because there was a conservation easement. I didn't understand that if the conservation easement actually doesn't count it, right, then it's not necessarily protected. Well, this is what they found in the last week in December of the same space. There's nothing. It's been landscaped. And it was like I was gut punched. I mean, I was gut punched. I mean, I'm working with the documentary film director Irene Taylor on this. She's doing a documentary on HBO about trees, and my family is going to be one of those stories. And we were going to focus on this tree that is no longer present, right? And for about 2 days, I got incredibly depressed because I said, that's how it happened. So even if you have a little piece there, it's gone. For me, it was such a small thing, right? But after I kind of calmed down after 2 days, I started thinking about, this is actually the more true story. This is more what actually happens all the time. And my guess is the owners just didn't know, right? They didn't know because privilege has the privilege of not seeing itself. They didn't know in part because the land trust didn't know. I mean, there's all the levels of not knowing and selective, you know, choosing and just not having that in the story. But now I'm thinking about, well, it's an opportunity if I can get everybody on board that we can get back on that property and maybe replant a tree with the owner's involvement. Because at the end of the day, it is also about accountability and responsibility. It is not simply about remembering my family. It is also about how all the institutions that have the resources, you know, that have the access, you know, that have the privilege of centering these stories about who we are in relationship to the environment and the land also play a role in growing and changing.
Yeah, and actually that leads really into some of the questions that we've gotten around how organizations can do both what you called facing the legacy, you know, finding those stories and unraveling the privilege, but also around supporting Black and Indigenous people of color in their organizations or in their programming or in whatever their particular on the ground work is and how to do that. And so the reason I feel like there's both in what you just shared is because there's the remembering, there's the storytelling, there's the action. And I wanted to hear what your thoughts were on both, you know, the storytelling, remembering, and the action, and how do we balance those two things, and how do we balance the grief, the period of grief, the honoring?
Yes. So that's a good question. So first of all, I want to reframe it a little bit and say that storytelling and remembering are also actions. So part of what I find with organizations is that it's, you know, we start to separate out as though, because the storytelling seems like it is an act of remembering. It is an act of sharing. It is an act of learning. It is a practice, actually. It is a doing of storytelling. And we have to get good at it. Storytelling well means research, means actually examining your own ability to sort of understand and tell a story and making it and connecting it to an existing story that you're already working with. It's not denying one story in order to make space for another. It's actually how to bring them both together. It's how you might center yourself in the story, that the experience of expanding and changing the story is also a story about how we get better at thinking about and doing this. It's not the thing that happens simply behind the scenes. It's actually out loud. It's a strategy. It's a choice, as is the remembering, right? Yeah. Storytelling is one vehicle for remembering, not necessarily the only one for remembering, but it is one vehicle for doing that. So how does that fit? How does that fit in your meetings? How does this fit in if you are an interpreter and you work in a certain space, if you are an educator and you're doing classes, what does this look like? How does it impact the way you hire? In terms of the skill sets that you're looking for, not just how different a person looks or is, but also how their ability to actually bring themselves into the story, and their ability to do that will in part depend on your ability to create a space and a container that allows for them to show up as themselves, not simply fulfilling the chair that you put at your table because you wanted to outreach to them and bring them in, but nothing else changes and they have to learn everything about the table and the space. But actually one that means you got to get rid of the table and you got to come up with something else, which you decide together because it is an emergent opportunity. It means that actually, oh yeah, shoot, we're all on kind of uneven ground right now, but we're all in it together. So let's figure out what it's going to look like.
Sure. Yeah. Wow. That idea of being on uneven ground, you kind of talked about that, the being uncomfortable versus being safe, and the idea of having conversations in your meetings or in the spaces that maybe are typically safe for you have always been a certain way. It's sort of ripping off that Band-Aid. What would you suggest? I mean, I looked at during your presentation, the images you brought up. How would you suggest people use those images or even just their experiences to start those conversations in those rooms? So even identify we have an opportunity here to try to pick up the table.
Yeah. So, with respect to all the different kinds of people who are listening in and the different kinds of ways people show up in their work, one of the things I do when I teach a class, when I work with students who are interested in environmental issues, is I have everybody write an environmental autobiography. And I mean, short, 3 pages, 4 pages. I'm like, you can't get it wrong. I'm asking them to do that in part is to figure out where they stand. So part of that, when I think of where they stand in terms of their bias, their point of view, their experience, those places where their whole self, they may not normally bring into an environmental class, instead of thinking of themselves as simply repositories of what I choose to share and what they read, that they're actually fully engaged with their own growth around this work, because they're going to be doing this work probably longer than me because they're younger than me. And I'm thinking about know thyself, right? I didn't create that. Know thyself in relationship to non-human nature, because that's what this is all about, relationship. This is all about relationships. So what is yours? And yours is never static. It is fluid. So do you understand that as an organization, what are the ecosystem of, and I just learned this from, he's the new Black executive. He's not newly Black, but he's Black. And he's the new executive director of 350.org in Minneapolis, in Minnesota, Sam Grant, a really amazing man who talked about the ecosystem of relationships. What is the ecosystem of relationships that any organization has? You're starting off just being honest. Like, what are they in terms of who they are, what you know, who you don't? So you can almost start mapping that out for yourself about further action beyond the storytelling. Or what does that mean to storytell? Who actually should tell the story? Because that's a question. Should everybody be able to tell the same story? Here's what I feel. This is broad brushstroke, and I know it can be unpacked, is that if you always start from where you are, you can tell a story. It is the way you do it with yourself and or your organization in relationship to the story, the honesty there. I believe, as far as I know, I have no relatives associated with Japanese internment or the Holocaust. I believe I can tell a story about Japanese internment and the Holocaust as long as I actively and transparently situate myself in relation to that, not provide some universal voice as though I'm all knowing about these things, but that I am actually, those two things have meaning in my life because I learned about them. I know them. I actually know people who both those moments in history have deep personal meaning for them. So that means it has something for me there. And I can talk about my own perspective as a Black woman, or what does it mean to carry around trauma? Or how do we, you know, I can have these conversations more broadly. How do we memorialize those moments? How do we remember together? We don't have to have the same memory, but there's a place of connection. So part of the work of storytelling a story that may not be yours, you know, personally, is look at the intersection of where you stand in relationship to the story, the honesty, the vulnerability that you will need to engage to be able to show up with that. Because then that's what creates the container for somebody else to do it. You know, I invite others to find their place in relationship to the story. I believe all these stories are human stories that are all of ours, right? And we are all responsible to these stories, right?
So what's really interesting about just that idea of storytelling and sharing from your position, it makes me think about two things I've noticed every time you speak, is that you use the word non-human nature. And the reason I notice, I think, is because as a scientist myself, an environmental scientist, I look at nature and I look at myself separately. And in telling those stories and then putting myself into that story, and I'm sort of pulling out of my analytical scientific side. And actually there was a question too about an environmental science, you know, the reception to this kind of conversation. How would you like to kind of comment or reflect on that, the separation in our environmental science mind sometimes, even when we're just stewarding the land and we feel connected to it, but we separate maybe our human self from the nature self?
Yeah, I saw somebody just threw out Octavia Butler. Absolutely. Just want to shout out to Octavia Butler. Yeah, so this is interesting one, the one of environmental science and the question of science. There's two ways I think about it. One is, I think, just, you know, historically as a country, you know, what the Western perspective was of thinking of humans as nature as separate, which is not the indigenous perspective, right? Which is, I think that's the first, you know, the first point of separation that gave us some of the problems we have right now. You know, we've got this separation that we operate in, whereas thinking ourselves as part of nature, that we are part of an ecosystem, not at the top of the ecosystem, but we're actually in relationship to the ecosystem, would change the way that we actually, I believe, engage with that ecosystem. Look, you know, I think that in order to do some of the things we've done to the landscape for the last 400 years, in order to do the things that we've done to some of the people that we've done it to over the last 400 years, we've had to separate ourselves. That's a psychological mess. How do you enslave people? How do you treat the land so poorly for your own gain? Without separating yourself from it? I mean, if it was actually part of you, it would be a lot harder to make that choice, right? So I think there's a lot of, you know, I think that that's part of the argument, is the framing. I have, you know, my PhD is in geography, which is a social science. I am very much from the arts and humanities. So I lean way over to the left of that, right? With social science, I mean, I had that training, but humanities and arts, and I'm really clear and transparent about that's where I like to live, you know, out there in the abstract and bringing it all in, that everything becomes open and valuable to the conversation. My challenge as somebody having worked in and been hired into a department where it was heavy on environmental science is the inability of some of those scientists to see my perspective or way of engaging as having any value. And, you know, it cost me actually to do that at a very liberal and progressive university known as Berkeley. And I'm just going to say it there. And it was a fight for 2 years where it was some of the scientists who just didn't like the way that I put the I in the narrative. Didn't like the way that I pulled on art and all the different ways we told story, because simply for no other reason than the fact that for the most part, African-Americans weren't able to engage in all these spaces of knowledge production throughout history. So if I was and I couldn't, as a doctoral student in the early 2000s, I could hardly find anything on the library shelves at my college about Black people in the environment. It was crazy. So if I relied only on that, how would I tell a full story? It was like, my doing the research was actually making the point that I was trying to make. It didn't mean we weren't there. It didn't mean we didn't have knowledge. Didn't mean we weren't creating knowledge. Didn't mean we weren't engaged. It just means we weren't being seen. And so part of it for me is, I mean, I'm all down with science. Did you all hear me say how much I love Carl Sagan? Part of the reason I love Carl Sagan is because he was open as a scientist to thinking more broadly about how we know the world, how we know ourselves, how we know ourselves in the world. And that all those spaces, and also the mystery of who we are and how we show up. So you may be talking about spirit. Yes, I said it. You may be talking about dreamlike. Yes, I said it. All those things that we cannot measure. For me, is partly what makes life so intriguing and exciting and possible and optimistic, because we can't measure everything. And it isn't the only way to know. It isn't the only way to know who we are and where we are going, but it is one incredibly powerful way of knowing who we are and where we're going. You see, I really got worked. I got a little emotional there.
But I thank you, because as you said, we are human nature, and there's non-human nature. We are all nature. We are all connected. So I really wanted to thank you for that perspective, and kind of bring it forward into the now a little bit. There was a question submitted about conservation goals, even for the current administration. We're looking at what sort of present day, in the name of conservation, I think of it as a field of conservation that I've come into. In my PhD, I was studying marine sciences. I was studying the natural world, but not in the context of conservation. And so I think that brings us back into that conversation too about land and ownership, et cetera. But I just wonder what you would like to share with everybody today about current goals that are in the conservation community and what they need to take into account in terms of this reconnection to our story and our facing of our legacy.
Yeah, great question. So, Kirsten, you will remember as soon as I say this, that I often don't use the word goal. I use the word intention. And the reason I do, I use the word intention as well as aspiration, because a goal implies, sometimes an end game. And I don't think there's an end game. I think it's just a long game. And I think as human beings, we tend to think in 100-year increments. We don't think in geologic time. Or, I was on a panel this past Saturday with a young Native American artist named Jeremy Dennis, who pointed to something that in his family history, it's called 7 generations. And what they say to each other is, think about everything you do and think 7 generations out, what kind of impact it will have. And I was like, I wrote that down. I was like, that's deep. That is what and that's also, that is the long game, right? Yeah. So, I think about what are the intentions of this administration, those working in the area of conservation, and broadly, conservation for me is not unrelated to climate change, which is a really important part of the conversation and understanding how we're going to show up in this moment. I think that it is not unrelated to who's placed in leadership positions. So the first Native woman to be the Secretary of the Interior. I mean, that blew me away, because what I've been saying all throughout this is, it's just that when you get somebody, one of the first people, right, in America, in the United States of America, from the first peoples in that position of leadership, in terms of perspective, point of view, ability to see and understand beyond the existing policy language, which has not historically included or acknowledged the perspectives of those non-white individuals, right, in this country. That's deep. That in and of itself alone, I can't wait to see what's going to happen, just in terms of not even what projects get chosen to be focused on, but the languaging of those projects, how it's shared with the public, how the public is invited to engage, how we understand words like community anew. What do we mean by that? How we understand the urban-rural divide differently. Yikes, I hate saying urban-rural divide, because that divides us, right? But how do we think about those unique environments and the unique conservation needs of all those spaces in ways that focus on the relationship, the kind of horizontal relationship, not the hierarchical one. What does that look like? So in part for me, those conservation intentions and aspirations are going to spring through all of those things, the different languaging, the new leadership, the different formations, the willingness of people to consider where the resources go, and what those resources look like. Because I understand that What do they say? That old one my father always said, it's nothing like the greenback dollar. My father always used to say that. I'd be like, Dad, it's not only about money, but I understand the role of money in that. And there's other kinds of resources in terms of leveraging one's power and position. That's a resource. Right. Political connection, that's a resource. The difference to even know about an opportunity and get that information where somebody else doesn't have that support, because we have a lot of individuals and organizations of color out there who've been doing this work for a long time, who are supremely skilled to meet this moment and simply do not have the resources and or the opportunity. Mm-hmm. Okay. It's not, for me, the choice may mean, and I believe we can do everything simultaneously, because I just believe we have that capacity we always have as a human beings. But let's stop for a moment and say you don't think so. We already have existing individuals and people doing this work that have been trying to get their foot in the door for the last 10, 20, 30 years, who've been quietly and not so quietly doing this work. What does it mean to build relationship with them and give them the resources and see where it goes? How do we develop that trust? Because part of this is trust. Around sustainability and conservation, I always say, what is it that we're trying to sustain? Not only conversations about energy and water and land. Yes, please let us be having those conversations, but also about relationship with communities. That when we say environmental justice, it is not only thinking about poor Black and brown communities as though they're not fully capable of doing what it is they've been doing. They've been resilient this entire time. What does it mean to reconsider what that means? And by the way, you don't have to figure it out on your own, because they can tell you. So what does it mean to actually give them the space, the opportunity to talk about it, to write about it, to show up on Capitol Hill? What does that look like? Right. I'm rolling now. If I could stand up, I would. I'd be pacing. Yes.
I was going to say, if we were in person, I think there'd be a lot of applause, there'd be murmurs, there'd be some amens.
Yes.
So there was two things that stood out that had come up in the questions that I wanted to kind of expand on a little bit. Somebody asked how your thoughts were around land acknowledgements that are popping up a lot more. Yes. And at the same time, also another question was asking about how to avoid tokenism in the inclusion of these moments. And so I felt like both of those were kind of in what we just talked about a little bit, with some of the connection to communities along with land and providing resources. Okay. So if you could just expand a little bit on that, give us some concrete things.
So land acknowledgement. And I don't think I said it in the beginning, but in Burlington, I'm on the traditional land of the Abenaki here. I think land acknowledgement is in many ways almost the simplest place we can begin. And the question is, how far back do you want to go? Mm-hmm. So when that thing happened with the cherry tree with my parents, the story I told you, one of the things that I realized, I got so angry, and I wrote this piece about, when people want to become citizens of this country, they have to know everything about our history, man. They just go in more than some of us who were born here, and they can rattle off everything, right? Why is it, why can't, when people want to buy a piece of land, they have to know everything about the land before they can buy it? Doesn't matter how much money they have, right? So I'm writing this piece because I just kind of got mad about it. I said, you have to know the history before you can own it. That is part of the responsibility. Then I started thinking, Carolyn, you never go back before those 50 years when your parents are there. What are you going to do about it? Right? So I've been actually doing that. Actually, I'm working with the film director and the archivist. So far, we've gotten back to the 1800s, right? So part of it is, I think we all have to start somewhere. And, I know the tokenism thing. Part of what tokenism means to me is that it's only symbolic, it's only surface, and we never move any further beyond that, Mm. You have to start where you are. And sometimes it begins with I'm going to say this thing, you know, that I know that the Abenaki, you know, were the traditional peoples here. I don't know any more than that right now, and I'd like to know more, but I want to at least start with where I'm at and try to make that a habit of mine each time I'm somewhere and thinking about who were the original peoples who were here. I think that we have to be honest with ourselves about where we are. That's the risk. That's the discomfort. That's what I'm talking about. And sometimes you're not going to get it right, right? And the power is when you don't get it right and somebody called you out, it's your ability to show up again to attend to that impact of your good intention and not getting it right. That's the growth. That's the power. That's how the trust gets built, right? How do you keep showing up? Not how you kind of go, oh God, I screwed it up. I'm never going to say it again. You know, that silence, that kind of silence in that moment, that choice is a privilege. Silence isn't always a privilege, but to make that choice in that moment for me is a privilege. It's to show back up and say, you know, I know that's what I said before and I didn't get it quite right and I'm working on it. There's something, again, to be said about radical vulnerability. It's something to be said about an individual's or an organization's or an institution's or an agency's willingness to be open about their own growth and who they are. Remember, all those places and spaces are made up of people. You know, the idea that we're holding on to some idea of who we've been before, like, what? We're not, that's not where we are, but we have that history.
Right.
Right. And so I come into it going, you know, I can stop midstream at any moment. You can make a different choice. That is powerful. And that actually means something. And that means you take a risk at any moment you can do it. For me, there was no right moment. There just is now. So you want to say something different, say something different. You want to do something different when you go to your meeting tomorrow, do something different. Bring that article in for everybody to read. And, you know, you might get some faces looking at you. Say that, you know, here's what I'm doing. I'm trying out here. That's the going out on our limb. Sam Grant, who I mentioned earlier, when we were talking last week, you know, one of the things he said was, we all have to come to our edge now. We all have to do it. The edge won't be in the same place, but around the conservation, the environmental work, the people mending work, the relationship mending work that we have to do requires everybody to come to their edge. And that's scary, except the good news is if we're all on the edge, then we're all in it together, right? So that's where the possibilities emerge from once we're all there.
Yeah, I think that's really well put. I was going to say the biggest thing that I've experienced when I started to step into these places is whether people meet me there and whether they're willing, as you said, to mess up and whether I'm willing to mess up. There's a lot of conversations I've participated in where I'm like, I'm not sure the right way to address this. However, stepping in anyway. And I think when it comes to this whole discussion today, we have a lot of people on the call. We have a lot of people in the chat. There's too many people for us to keep track of all the questions and all of the things that are being raised, but we can all take away that we can show up, tend to our good intentions,
yes,
and just start where we are.
Yes.
So I really appreciated that. I really appreciate this discussion. There's so many things I didn't get to address. But in the last few minutes, I wanted to ask you if there was anything else you wanted to talk about. Somebody actually asked about Sweet Beginnings, if you wanted to shout out to them, and also to let Chicago Wilderness jump in if they have anything else to wrap up before we close at 3:30.
Oh yeah, because it's Chicago Wilderness. Yes, I have to say something. Sweet Beginnings. It took me a second there. You know, I always love to talk about Sweet Beginnings and Brenda Palms Barber, who I met back in the 2000s. She was one of the first people I interviewed when I was working on this as a dissertation, when I was working on Black Faces, White Spaces as a dissertation. And she told me a story of how she actually had been living in Denver and got invited to come to Chicago because there were a lot of previously incarcerated Black men and women who when they came out of jail, couldn't get a job. And so her work was to get to know communities and work together to think about what could they come up with. And she said they came up with some pretty good ideas like landscape gardening, driving around the elderly, and all these ideas they thought were good, but didn't have real legs over time. And Brenda was saying how she was having a random conversation with a friend who was just talking about beekeeping. And as her friend was talking, Brenda was like, that's a great idea. That's what we should do. And she said, we're going to do make honey and honey related products on the west side of Chicago. And she said a lot of people thought she was crazy. And basically now she is an incredibly successful company, a business, Sweet Beginnings, that makes honey and honey related products on the west side of Chicago. One of the many things she told me was that for the first year in, she had no idea she had been running a green business the whole time. You know, when people, because she didn't even know what that meant, like in the parlance, you know, of the environmental movement, but she'd been doing it naturally. She hadn't been feeding her bees sugar derivatives. She'd been acting locally. Everybody who gets a job at Sweet Beginnings, regardless of your position in the company, has to know the life cycle of the bee. You have to learn it. But the other story that she's told me that stuck with me is when she interviewed some of these young Black men and women for the job. And she would talk about being in front of them and say, you know, so you're looking for a job? And they say, yes. And she'd say, so you just got out of jail? And they'd say, yeah. You know, they're usually looking a little embarrassed about that. And she said, what were you in jail for? And they'd say, selling drugs. And she said she'd do a kind of dramatic pause. So were you good at it? And usually they'd say, yeah, until I got caught. And she'd say, so what were you good at? And they would usually say, well, I understood the quality of my product. I understood the value of my customer base, and everything they rattled off. She'd be like, them are excellent skills and knowledge. Yes. We're just gonna move that over here, right, to this legal activity. But for me, part of the point she was making, one, that these weren't empty vessels that needed to be filled, that they had full lives and embodied knowledge, that it was actually had value to the company and to the business and to the intention. Mm-hmm. The other thing was that it wasn't about outreach. It was actually about building a relationship of reciprocity. Again, it wasn't simply providing them with this opportunity and bringing them to her table. It was about saying, we're kind of going to meet. There's reciprocity here. You got some skills, you got some knowledge, you know, you probably got some stuff you don't even know you got. So I want to take advantage of that. And here's what I'm going to offer. And we're going to build together, right? And it's really powerful. The story was always really powerful in part because maybe a year after or two after I met her, she invited me out to give a talk along with some other people to an audience of about 100 people. And after I had given my talk, one of these young men, she invited him to come on stage and speak for a few minutes. So he got up and he was in his suit and he looked really uncomfortable. You know, when you see somebody who's young in a suit, he looked kind of shy, and he was in front of the microphone and he had his, you know, his head kind of down a little bit. And the first thing he said out of his mouth was, I never knew green would be so good to me. That's what he said. And I was in tears, half the front row was in tears, you know. Wow. Because he just said, I never knew green could be so good to me. And in that moment, I mean, I don't remember what he said after that because it didn't matter almost, because that was so powerful. That told oceans, that told stories, so many stories about how he saw himself, how he was seen, what green means, how green is fluid and changes, how he had something to contribute, how other people, including the company that he now worked in, could change over time, and what was possible as they move forward together. Yeah. That is awesome. Thank you for sharing that. Yeah. You can hold that. What green means to each of us is so different. Oh, wow. And has value. It has value. All of our stories have value. And that's the power, that's the mystery, that's where something new might emerge. Yeah. If we make space for those stories. Yeah. Well, thank you for helping us make space today. Yeah. Thank you for the emergent conversation. Yeah. Thank you for staying on with us through this long time, trying to find out when to get you here. Yes, here I can't wait. I told everybody it's crazy because I miss Chicago O'Hare, and because I miss traveling so bad, but I actually miss Chicago O'Hare. Wow. Oh my God. Christian, thank you. That was great. I feel like, thank you everybody who, stayed on, who came today. I saw a lot of fabulous people out there who are showing up in their own ways, doing their own work. And I'm with you, and I can't wait to meet a lot of you or see a lot of you someday in person soon. again.
All right, let's do that. Thank you, Carolyn. And Laura, I see you put up the slide that has a bunch of the links and also my contact information for anybody who wants to track me down here in Chicago. As I said, I'm a scientist. I do endangered species research. So excited to talk to anybody about that. Laura, is there anything else you want us to highlight before we sign off? Say good day.
No, I just want to say a big thank you to everybody who was here today. It was wonderful. And thank you, Carolyn. You've inspired us all. Let's continue this conversation.
All right. Well, have a great afternoon, everyone. Stay safe.
Yes.
All right.